Hello and welcome back to this damnful idealistic crusade. In this video, I want to talk about the Knight of Darkness himself, the Shadow, the immortal character from the Pulp magazines, primarily written by Walter Gibson, who wrote the vast majority of the 300-plus Shadow Pulp novels, and a character who is not to be confused with the more well-known Radio Incarnation, which is essentially an entirely different characterization that runs parallel to the Pulp Shadow. So Shadow fans usually have to decide whether they're a fan of the Pulp Shadow or the Radio Shadow, or you are able to enjoy both. Although it must be said very clearly whenever someone is getting more interested in the character that the Radio and Pulp Shadows are two vastly different characters. They share some of the same iconography and, of course, the name, but outside of that and certain other characters crossing over into the Pulp Shadow realm, they really don't have all that much to do with each other, because the Radio Shadow, of course, has the power to cloud men's minds, whereas the Pulp Shadow has no superpowers. He is merely a figure of darkness, determined to fight crime for all eternity, and we don't even know all that much about the Shadow, particularly here at the start in the first novel, which is what I'm going to be focusing on in this video. But it's a common misconception that the Radio Shadow is the Pulp Shadow, but they are entirely different. The Pulp Shadow came first, starting in 1931, with The Living Shadow, the first novel, but ironically the whole reason why the Shadow was granted a magazine by Street and Smith and inadvertently sparked off the boom in hero pulp magazine characters and magazines devoted entirely to one hero character. The whole reason for this was due to the success of the Shadow on radio. Before this point, as a part of Detective Story Hour and other iterations, they had an announcer who was rather creepy and mysterious and had the evil, menacing, mocking laugh known as the Shadow. And this became the most popular part of this radio program. So much so that when people came asking for the magazine that show was ostensibly promoting for Street and Smith, people were just asking for the Shadow magazine. So the brilliant, fine folks at Street and Smith decided, we should actually do something with this character who's kind of become a hit, even though it was just a character idea done for a sort of marketing gimmick and just to announce and host the stories. And in one of the great fortuitous moments in art, they turned to Walter Gibson, who was a writer with a extremely varied background, but particularly was extraordinarily fond of puzzles and cryptograms, and also was a magician himself and had even written for his great friend Houdini. He even ghost wrote books for Houdini. So Gibson had been trying to create a story around a certain character who had essentially elements of Sherlock Holmes and classic mystery solving, with a great focus on sleight of hand and all the aspects of great magicians who would be battling crime, and was also a master of disguise and was essentially a very mysterious figure at the core of a fantastic mystery. So the Shadow gave him the perfect impetus to basically work out this idea he had been trying to formulate into a novel. And so in 1931, we saw the premiere of the character as we know it in terms of the pulp iteration in 1931's The Living Shadow, which is the first of the 325 pulp novels, the vast majority of which would be written by the genius Walter Gibson, who was cranking out multiple novels a month, which is just staggering. And in fact, he was cranking out so many novels and writing so quickly that at one point he had been using typewriters so diligently and so extremely that he had to physically stop for a period of time so his fingers and hands could actually recuperate from the extreme wear and tear of constantly writing on typewriters. And this, of course, echoes what you see when you read about other writers of the pulp magazine era who were just churning out stories and getting paid usually by the word, and just trying to fill the incredible appetite the public had for this cheap form of entertainment that fostered an explosion of creativity in American literature. But what Gibson did that sets him apart is that his stories weren't just tossed off. And while they had different themes and different sort of eras, if you look at the whole run of the Shadow novels, he was always a cut above a lot of the other pulp writers in terms of he thought about all of his plots. He tried to work out all of the mysteries. He filled them with all kinds of puzzles and cryptograms and codes, and also kept the Shadow himself always a bit in the dark, always a bit mysterious. We focused more on the agents of the Shadow and the incredible network the Shadow has established than we do on the Shadow himself, at least at the start. And then over the course of the novels, we start getting more and more of the Shadow in action and more of the background of the character. But it's always pieces that are revealed slowly over time, or they're doled out individually to keep the reader invested and interested. And it's thus the world of the Shadow that is the most interesting, because it's not just a character, it's a character and an entire universe that feels as if it is steeped or really comprised entirely of mystery and intrigue. Of course, the Shadow does have a true identity, which was eventually revealed to be that of Lamont Cranston, but this being Walter B. Gibson and the Shadow, he was not content to simply have one secret identity. It was eventually revealed later in the pulp novels that, unlike the radio series Shadow, who simply was Lamont Cranston, the Shadow was too crafty to just have a secret identity. Lamont Cranston was merely an identity of a rich, wealthy playboy he had assumed. And in actuality, his true identity was that of Kent Allard, a World War I fighting ace who had been missing and presumed dead for a great number of years. But even though it's a great answer to a trivia question, knowing the true identity of the Shadow and not giving the name that is actually the cover, knowing who the Shadow actually is doesn't actually fully give you the complete picture of this character. It's left up to the reader reading as many novels as they can get their hands on to form their own mental picture. So it puts the reader very much in the place of one of the Shadow's agents who are recruited into the Shadow's never-ending battle against crime. And it's the agents who are very human and understandable and relatable. So the agents are actually the reader's inroads into the world of the Shadow. Then you find yourself getting wound up in the actual mystery and the action sequences and trying to anticipate what comes next and trying to puzzle out the solution along with the Shadow. So while these are still novels from the Pulp Fiction era designed to entertain readers for a few cents, and they were written extremely quickly, so they had to have constant movement and a good sense of action to them to keep people entertained, the Shadow stories really are a cut above most because of what Gibson put into them. And you really get this when you start reading the Shadow novels almost immediately, especially if you've ever read any of the other pulp characters, or really any pulp stories from the golden age of pulp magazines. You also have to look at the impact and the legacy of the character, because the Shadow is quite possibly the most influential character in American fiction. That's not a stretch to say that, because while the idea for the character and having a single hero character pulp magazine was inspired by the legendary Nick Carter, who had preceded the Shadow and was a media sensation, then also, of course, Johnson Macaulay's Zorro being extraordinarily popular in the 1920s, and also other hero precursors going all the way back to the Scarlet Pimpernel, and of course, even throwing in Sherlock Holmes as well. The Shadow is the point at which all of this material really crystallizes, and the Shadow spawned every major hero character that people think of and associate with the pulp era. This is also because the Shadow was an immediate success in 1931, and that basically sparked all of the other publishers to try and compete with that. But then you have to look at how the emergence of the comic book medium in the golden age of comics in the late 30s, particularly starting with Superman and Batman in 1938 and 1939, you have to look at how comic books so completely, the kind word is borrowed, but the truer terms would more likely be lifted wholesale, borrowed greatly, or in certain cases completely plagiarized elements and stories from the pulp characters and pulp magazine era. Without the pulp heroes, you would not have a comic book industry that we know of it. And all of the genre elements, all of the tropes, the cliches, the character types, everything that we take for granted in terms of comics and superheroes, and also quite a lot of modern pop culture, it really goes back to the Pulp characters, and even further, it goes back to the Shadow, because the Shadow was the first of the major 1930s characters. The Shadow spawned an entire industry of characters who were inspired by, and some were direct Shadow knockoffs. And of course, the Shadow was the primary influence on Batman, who, you know, when you read the first stories, he did actually start as a clone of the Shadow, just as a lot of Pulp characters started as Shadow clones, or were just clones of the Shadow without even trying to hide it. Of course, Batman is made up of other character inspirations, but the Shadow also influenced basically every hero character that came afterwards. And it's not just the character and the world and the setup of the stories, but it's also the elements that were unique to Gibson's writing, whether it was having the extended group of agents, or how the Shadow dealt with the police force and worked around and inside the confines of the law, but also certain elements such as a rogues gallery of recurring villains, building a universe that had interconnectivity between the stories, even though each story was a standalone story, having stories that flowed into one another, and so essentially had, while they were individual novels, they had linkages. So again, there's not one element that people associate with comics or hero characters that cannot be traced back to Walter Gibson and the Shadow novels. They are just, when you first read them, or you can pick up any of them, and you start one and you just go, my God, is this where it all started? And then you realize, yes, it is. They're, of course, precursors to anything. And as I mentioned before, the primary ones would be especially Nick Carter, Macaulay's Zorro, and, of course, Sherlock Holmes. But never before had all these disparate elements and character types been brought together into such a unified vision that then proceeded to have over 300 novels, mostly written by the same person, and I think Gibson still has the world record for the most words written about a single character or subject by one author. I mean, his contribution to American literature just for the Shadow novels that he wrote is just beyond immense. But without the Shadow, there would be no Doc Savage. Without the Shadow and Doc Savage, there would be no Superman and Batman. There would not be the comic book industry that we know of. There wouldn't have been the pulp explosion that we know of in terms of pulp hero characters. The entire pop culture landscape would be radically different. So it is impossible to fully calculate the influence of this one character and what the Shadow sparked off. But the timeless aspect is not just the incredible legacy of the character and how the Shadow essentially inspired great swaths of popular culture, but it is the intelligence behind the stories, and even the ones that Gibson didn't write. Most of those were written by Theodore Tinsley, who had more of an action focus, and in fact, it was one of his Shadow novels, Partners in Peril, that was completely ripped off for the first Batman story in Detective Number 27 in May 1939. So where Doc Savage was the greatest influence on Superman, and Superman lifted wholesale from Clark Savage Jr., the Man of Bronze, Batman started as a Shadow clone, lifting wholesale from the Shadow. But every other hero character had taken things from the Shadow before that, and every hero character since has basically taken at least something from the Shadow or been inspired by the Shadow, whether they knew it or not, because the Shadow laid the groundwork for everything that followed. But the stories themselves are just as fresh and exciting as they were in their original releases in the pulp magazines, going all the way back to 1931 and The Living Shadow. So to talk a little bit about this first novel, this is a work that obviously is having to set up the entire world of the character and introduce the reader to elements that are going to become cherished throughout the rest of the series. But it being a first novel, when compared to other books, it is having to lay the groundwork. So it is a little bit slower, and I think the best way to describe it is that it does meander a little bit. That's not a bad thing, but it is very understandable that because it's the first book, it's not as really honed in exactly on all the core elements. You get the sense that there's some fine tuning that's being done. But what's really interesting is that it doesn't detract from the story that's being told. And since this is the first foray into the Shadows world, it actually works in a sort of hypnotic way. It lulls the reader into a particular mindset that is perfect for the Shadows world of mystery. So in this novel, we open with one of the most iconic scenes in the series where Harry Vincent is on a bridge on a foggy night and has nothing to look forward to. His life, essentially, he feels is over. He's extremely depressed and decides he's going to throw himself off the bridge and commit suicide until a masked hand comes out of the darkness and offers him a choice. And so Harry Vincent becomes an agent of the Shadow. This is the best example of how the Shadow's agents are the human characters who are the connectors for the reader to get into this world. Because in the early books, the Shadow is extremely in the darkness and not always very much defined. So you do need the agent characters to humanize the stories and give you those connector points of having someone to relate to, because the Shadow is like an unstoppable force who seems to have abilities that are beyond human comprehension, but has no superpowers. He simply is the Shadow, and thus is that good. Harry Vincent accepts his new mission in life, but is very much perplexed and confused as heck about what is happening to him. And this, again, is the perfect character for the new reader to this new series to identify with. So it's Harry Vincent's indoctrination into the world of the Shadow that indoctrinates the reader as well. So we're always on the same page with the character we're following. Harry Vincent is tasked with following seemingly a shoe salesman, but said salesman is actually helping to smuggle around stolen jewels for a gang, and this is somehow tied to the nefarious activities of a Chinese criminal known as Wang Fu, who operates out of Chinatown. And Chinatown, being here in the first Shadow story, is very fitting, as the Shadow famously would always have stories set in a sort of mythical Chinatown that never quite existed in reality, where around every corner could lurk strange goings on or all kinds of larger than life elements that are frankly intoxicating to a reader's imagination, even if obviously real Chinatowns aren't quite like that. But Chinatown became a very central location throughout all of Shadow lore, so it's fitting that a significant portion of the first novel takes place in Chinatown. But really the only reason this happened is that the cover of the novel actually utilized a pre-existing image of a Chinese character, and so Gibson somehow was able to just magically rewrite his own story that he was working on to incorporate a character and a setting, and this became part of the overall lore of the series. Harry Vincent moves further into the world of the Shadow, and we see familiar faces and elements start to get introduced. Here in the first novel, we have the agent Claude Fellows. We have the strange office where communications are left for the Shadow, marked simply as B. Jonas, who may be a person that doesn't even exist. We, of course, have references to the Shadow's famous Girasol ring and the Sanctum, where the Shadow goes to plan his next attack on crime. The lair of the Night of Darkness first appears here. But also, we even have the first appearance of the famous disappearing ink. When the Shadow communicates with his agents, they receive paper with writing on it in the Shadow's blue ink, and then after reading once, after a certain then period elapses, the ink then suddenly disappears. So Even the disappearing ink of the shadow appears here in the first novel. We have the appearance of Police Inspector Cardona and all of the shadow's disguises, which keeps the reader on their toes because there will be about faces or plot twists where suddenly you realize that the character you've been following or this background character actually is the shadow, and then you get to the point where you're trying to anticipate where that might happen. This, of course, is how the shadow learns about what the police are up to as he masquerades throughout the series as Fritz the janitor in police headquarters, which those scenes are always extraordinarily amusing because the shadow is able to essentially navigate unscathed through police headquarters for years, really. And then also, due to his mastery of disguise, this is how he's able to spirit Harry Vincent out of a particularly nasty death trap that he has no means of escaping. Then Harry Vincent finds himself essentially working on what is seemingly a completely unrelated or only tangentially related case of the death of a millionaire out on Long Island. And this is where I think in the story you really start to feel that the text is meandering a little bit, because there is quite a bit of Harry Vincent going back and forth between Long Island and downtown New York, and there's quite a lot of backtracking. But outside of that, it's just that the overall pacing does slow down quite a bit. There's not as many action sequences as there were in the sort of first act of the story. So it's essentially the writing sort of stretching its legs out, if you will. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but it is a bit odd at first if you're reading this story for the first time, because you don't necessarily get how this might fit with what we had in the first act. But by the conclusion, it is neatly tied together. But interestingly, we do have occurrences of not all the villains being captured or dealt with. Some do get away and do actually recur in other novels. One character, I believe, turns up in the second Shadow novel, but then the primary villain does not reoccur until the Chinese Dis. And so you have right here in the first book a prime example of a major recurring villain who becomes part of a rogues gallery of sorts. The best part is the final climax of the book, where the reader can follow along with the story, and whether you're able to anticipate certain things or you're basically taken completely by surprise, it's when all of the various plot threads start to come together. It's the great feeling you get at the close of any fantastic mystery, where you're starting to glimpse the solution. But with the shadow, it's the Knight of Darkness leading the charge and causing multiple plot twists and character reveals, and doing so effortlessly and executing his own plan to such a incredible degree that it causes that sort of wonderful spark of adventure and interest in the reader. So as you feel the elements drawing to a close and the solution of the mystery becomes clearer, that's when the shadow novels are usually at their most exciting. Again, some would have more of an action emphasis, so certain shadow novels will obviously go out with a bang, but in all the novels I've read so far, it's always when the plot threads are coming together in the climax where things are getting to a head and the reader's excitement level is at its greatest. And that's even here in the first novel. So while it is having to set some things up, and I do think the text kind of meanders a little bit, particularly in the midpoint, and then there are maybe one or two bits that are not necessarily tied up at the ending of this. It's at least understandable because it is the first novel, and the shadow doesn't. I mean, the shadow is fully formed. The world of the character doesn't have all the elements completely fine-tuned yet. So I think anybody reading this would be able to tell that this might be one of the earlier or the first story, just because it seems like Gibson is trying things for the first time in terms of writing the character and the world of the character. And as you read later novels, you can see how very quickly that fine tuning took place. And then we got basically multiple different eras of the character with different themes and styles, plus the other authors coming in to fill out the rest of the 300 plus novels. So it is an incredible debut novel. I think it is, without question, one of the most important literary debuts of any character ever. That's It just simply is. The very few characters could lay claim to the type of legacy and influence the Shadow has. Doc Savage, of course, but Nick Carter probably most of all, because that character kind of started a lot of these ideas and even predated Sherlock Holmes. But the Shadow is where everything crystallized. And this is an incredible book to be able to read nowadays, because it's just magical to be able to see the character come to fruition for the first time, even though not everything is fully ironed out or fully formed yet. But the character is at his most mysterious here, and you simply want to know more. As soon as you finish this novel, you want to read the next one. You want to keep going. So before this point, I'd read some of the novels, but I never thought I'd get the chance to read the books consecutively, and that's what I'm now trying to do. The best way to do this is, of course, in the beautiful Sanctum reprint volumes. This is volume 47. Now, Sanctum did not go in chronological order. They did usually 2, but sometimes even 3 or 4 novels in one volume in these beautiful reproductions. But this brings together Book 1, The Living Shadow, with the classic story, The Black Hush, as the second. On the back, you get reproductions of the original covers. So there, of course, is the cover of The Shadow #1 with the Chinese character, which, of course, this artwork was used previously. And so Street and Smith was just reusing this artwork. And that's why Gibson had to inject Chinese characters and a Chinatown setting in his story. But these are just, I think, the gold standard in terms of pulp reprints. They are done full size with wonderful scholarly articles and also tons of images. So you usually get a great foreword and then a nice article in the middle and then a nice piece at the end. So this, of course, is the opening of The Living Shadow with Harry Vincent about to jump off the bridge, and the Shadow emerges from the darkness to offer him a life as one of his agents. As you can see, this has the same beautiful reset type as all Sanctum editions, while also fully replicating the original dual column format style. So this gives you the exact experience of reading a pulp magazine, but essentially in a fully restored form, plus you don't have all of the advertisements breaking up the text. Now, normally the Shadow novels usually have some beautiful pulp illustrations throughout, but this being the first novel, all you really have is the first illustration. But just for example, in one of the Sanctum reprints, you'll have artwork in the other books scattered throughout, like this full page illustration from The Black Hush. So it's just, this being the first Shadow novel, there's only the one illustration. Then we have pieces on Walter Gibson, and the great Will Murray writes the interlude talking about elements of both of these novels. So it's basically 2 different articles put into one, talking about the character's background, but then also talking about each of the novels in this volume. But the really important thing about the Sanctum reprint is that it is the entire text of The Living Shadow, which at some point was actually cut down for republication. This happened to a number of Shadow novels, and also would happen to other pulp stories where if they did get reprinted, it wasn't always in the original full length. So the only way you get to read the entirety of The Living Shadow is either having Sanctum Volume 47, or you have to have an original 1931 pulp copy, which of course is going to cost you an unbelievable amount of money just to have a complete copy, regardless of condition. So as far as I'm aware, all the vintage paperback reprints of The Living Shadow are actually a slightly cut down version, and this did happen to some of the Shadow novels. So that's why the Sanctum versions are so important, because they're always reprinting the full-length version. Again, you do have to jump around in the volume numbering because they didn't go chronologically. So for example, this again is volume 47. So if you're just reading individual volumes, that's fine because the character is meant to be able to just pick up a shadow novel and read it. But if you want to get the full effect, I think it's helpful to read the characters chronologically so you can see the sort of progression over time and how the authors developed and how other authors would come in. And over time, there were basically certain eras of the style of the stories in terms of the early 30s versus the late 30s, the World War II years, the mid to late 40s. They're all kind of different from one another, and so that's why I'm trying to read them chronologically. The problem is Sanctum is now pretty much out of business. Condé Nast owns all of the Street and Smith characters and did pull the license when Sanctum was only a couple books away from having reprinted the whole Shadow series. So all the volumes have gone out of print. They have skyrocketed on the used market, and I've been one of the many fans buying them like crazy whenever I can find them and hopefully not pay through the nose. So basically, if you find any Sanctum volumes, you should just snap them up. But it is getting very difficult to get all the volumes. For the Shadow, they were able to do 151 plus 2 annuals, and then you have to source the handful of other stories, which I think were just 3 of the Bruce Eliot ones. It's like 3 or 4 that Sanctum didn't get to do. So they did almost the entirety of the Shadow in terms of all the pulp novels, but they remain the gold standard for, I think, not just the Shadow, but pulp reprints in general. But it's just a shame that they're no longer available, and you have to search them out wherever you can find them, and then the rarer volumes you get into eBay bidding wars. So I hate to recommend things that are not commonly available, but there are at least the vintage paperbacks from the 60s and 70s that you can get for most, or at least a good portion of the Shadow novels. But keep in mind, such as on The Living Shadow, that will actually be a slightly cut down version and not the full text that you can only really get here in the Sanctum reprint. So this one's extremely important. Of course, with the first issue coming out in 1931, we are nearing the point at which the character might start crossing over into the public domain. So it's entirely possible that the stories themselves might eventually start being able to be reprinted for free by fans or publishers specializing in public domain texts, especially in Europe and other countries who have different copyright statutes. So it may be in the next couple years that we might start seeing at least the early novels be freely available. But of course, it's possible they wouldn't get the full text for the books that were cut down some, and of course, they probably won't have the original illustrations, and they won't be as beautifully restored and presented as the Sanctum editions with their great historical essays and informative pieces and beautiful reproductions of the cover artwork and things. So again, it's a shame that the Sanctum versions are out of print, but at least that is I think the best version to try and have of the Shadow canon, which is unbelievably important. So essentially read whatever versions you can get, but try to get the Sanctum versions if you can. So I am going to continue on reading the series chronologically. I do have most of the Sanctum volumes that I've been able to track down, but I still have quite a ways to go. So this is going to be a very sporadic video series. Basically, whenever I can read the next Shadow novel and do a little video on it, that's what I'd like to do, because the character is timeless and endlessly fascinating and influenced basically everything that came afterwards. So I think it's one of the most rewarding series to read, because you will see so much of pop culture that simply wouldn't exist without the Shadow, because the Shadow spawned an entire genre that then became comic books. So and you read the greats of the pulp era, and you just see where everything comes from. It's just so obvious and in your face that you then wonder what would have happened back in the day if copyright laws were more strictly enforced as they are today. But it's also endearing and inspiring in a way, because you're seeing these ideas and these kinds of characters in their original forms before this stuff was set in stone or seen as tropes or cliched. There's a freshness there, because the greats of pulp literature were essentially writing the playbook that's been followed and copied ever since. So that's another reason why they're timeless and why they're so important. But of all the pulp characters, the Shadow is the king of pulp characters because he was the first of the sort of modern era of hero characters in 1931. The Shadow set the stage for every hero character that followed. The Shadow basically started the idea of a hero pulp magazine after that idea had been long dormant since the popularity of the Nick Carter character had sort of faded away from the dime novel era. So again, the Shadow's influence is just incalculable. And the fact that most of them were all written by the same person who put so much of themselves into these stories and wrote each and every one with a level of care and detail and craftsmanship while keeping up a staggering work volume and a workload that I just find unfathomable. It makes each and every Shadow novel all the more special to know that Walter B. Gibson was doing this time and time and time and time again, and somehow able to pull this off. It is. I will never know how he did it. I will never know how any of the great pulp writers were able to just crank out magical story after magical story. But all of Gibson's Shadow novels have intelligence behind them, and you feel that when you're reading them. That's, again, even, ignoring the fact that the Shadow was sort of the first and laid the groundwork for everybody that followed. Looking past that, you would know that these are a cut above or different from the majority of the other pulp novels, because the level of craftsmanship in the writing, even at that insane pace and workload, is different and a cut above everybody else. And as much as I love the classic pulp characters and from the ones that I've read, of course, and I really adore the writers, you can tell the difference between even a great Doc Savage story and a great Shadow novel. And of course, a great Spider novel is completely different from a great Shadow novel, because nobody else quite had that level of not only craftsmanship, but also seemingly this desire to make every novel as good as it possibly could be under all those unbelievable constraints. And it's at the conclusion of every Shadow novel, the climax of each book, when all the plot threads are coming together, that you're sitting there as a reader, and that's when you just start going, ah, that's it. Of course it had to be that. It could only be this ending. It could only be this solution of the plot. Every solution is so fitting. Every climax is so fitting that it adds such a degree of satisfaction that you've read a really great story. And that is why the Shadow novels are so fulfilling, because they fire on all cylinders, but they also have the magical energy of pulp fiction, but they have a completely unique identity of their own. There's nothing else in the realm of pulp fiction, or really fiction in general, like Walter B. Gibson's Shadow stories. They are some of the most important works in all of American literature, and pulp fiction should be accepted as literature because it is, and the era is arguably the greatest explosion of creativity that American literature ever saw or ever will see. But try getting this to be talked about in literary circles. But hopefully one day that might happen. But I just wanted to put this together for finally being able to read The Living Shadow in its complete form in the beautiful Sanctum reprint, which hopefully people will be able to track down if you haven't already. It is the perfect way to get introduced to the pulp version of the character, who again is completely different from the more famous radio incarnation. It's a timeless story, but it's also a great read, and that is further a reason why it is completely timeless. You can read it in 2024 and get the same incredible satisfaction as readers did in 1931, making the character an overnight sensation and starting the run of the most famous and most legendary of all pulp magazines, the Shadow magazine. So as always, I hope my babbles about the Night of Darkness, the wonderful magic of pulp fiction and pulp magazines, and the beauty of pulp reprints has been at least somewhat fun and informative. Again, I am trying to read all 300 plus shadow novels in chronological order because I am that guy and I like reading series in order. And I'm hoping to do a video on each shadow novel. But again, I'm trying to complete my collection of the Sanctum reprints. So already there's a great chunk of the run that I don't have any version of and have to figure out what version I can actually get my hands on. So again, this will be a very sporadic series in terms of uploads, but I will try to keep regularly plugging away at reading not only the Shadow series, but Doc Savage and of course the Avenger and the Spider and all the other classic pulp characters, because this is the material that you get to it and you simply just say, where has this been all my life? Because this is the classic material I've always been looking for. It is everything I've always loved in characters I've followed my whole life. And if you're a Batman fan and you've never read a Shadow novel, then what are you doing, honestly? Because the DNA of Batman, while I'll make the argument that Batman is a composite of at least 5 or 10, if not more, classical pulp characters, the core of the character still is the Shadow. I mean, Batman started as a Shadow clone, and the first Batman story was a direct copy of a Shadow novel without credits. I mean, you know, it's right there. So, again, if you're a Batman fan and you haven't read a Shadow novel, you have to. You really do. But if you're a fan of any superhero character, you need to read a Shadow novel, because without the Shadow, none of those characters would exist, frankly. That is the unending legacy and impact of the Night of Darkness. The Shadow is really the first truly modern hero character, but he himself has no superpowers, which makes him even more interesting and a far more complex and mysterious character than we ever saw in the iconic radio series. As much as I love and cherish the radio series, it's not the same as the pulp version. So if you only know the radio version of the Shadow, definitely check out the pulp version, because it's a completely different experience. So I just wanted to talk about the Shadow in general, but also my experience reading the very first Shadow novel, The Living Shadow, now that I've finally gotten to read the full version in the beautiful Sanctum reproduction. So as always, please do keep supporting your local independent bookstores by hopefully being able to find some Sanctum volumes if you can. Keep supporting the incredible work of publishers who are reprinting the magical tales of pulp fiction. Not only are they keeping these stories in circulation, but they're also restoring them and helping to preserve, I think, one of the most important aspects of all of American literature that is, frankly, without their efforts, very much in danger of being lost entirely to time and ignorance of said era. So they really are doing incredible work that needs to be championed more and talked about more, because frankly, even a couple years ago, I wasn't really aware of just the level of importance of what the publishers were doing, and just how many of them there were, and how long this has gone on, but just through more limited means, because they're all mostly smaller publishers or independent publishers just doing this out of the love of the medium. So keep reading print books, keep enjoying the magical world of pulp fiction, and as always, thank you ever so much for watching. And remember, the weed of crime bears bitter fruit. Crime does not pay. The Shadow knows. You shouldn't try to do your Shadow laugh that isn't very good to begin with after you just talk through a whole video.